The sun over West Texas was not a star, but a judgment. It hung in a bleached white sky, a relentless hammer beating down on the cracked earth until the very air shimmered with exhaustion. For Thaddeus Mallister, known only as Bear to the few who still spoke his name, the heat was just another layer of the silence that had become his life. His ranch, 100 acres of dust and defiance, was an island in a sea of scorched grass, its solitude a perfect mirror for the hollowed-out landscape of his soul. The clapboard house, bleached to the color of bone, stood against the endless horizon, its 2 glass windows like vacant eyes staring into the punishing glare. Inside, the air was thick and still, tasting of old wood, stale coffee, and the faint, persistent ghost of wood smoke. Bear moved through the quiet rooms with the heavy, deliberate gait of a man twice his age. At 34, his shoulders were already stooped by burdens that had nothing to do with labor. His hands, calloused and scarred from a life of wrestling with wire and wood, were gentle as they performed the day's only true ritual. He lifted the tintype photograph from the rough-hewn mantelpiece. The silvered plate was worn at the edges, its surface a constellation of tiny scratches, but the image it held was burned into his memory with a clarity that defied time. A woman, his Sarah, her smile a small, brave thing against the harsh backdrop of this same unforgiving land. And beside her, a boy, his Daniel, no older than 5, clutching a wooden horse with a grip of fierce, childish possession. Cholera had taken them in the space of a single fever-drenched week 3 winters ago. It had moved through their small settlement like a scythe, silent and indiscriminate, leaving a wake of fresh graves and shattered men. Bear had been one of them. He hadn't just lost a family. He'd lost his future, his past, and the very sound of his own name spoken with love. Now, there was only the silence, the heat, and this photograph, a physical anchor for a grief so vast it threatened to unmoor him entirely. He traced the line of Sarah's jaw with a thumb as thick as a root. He saw her eyes, tired but full of a stubborn light, and felt the familiar clench in his chest, a pain so constant it had become a part of his own heartbeat. "Morning, Sarah," he murmured, his voice a rough, unused thing. "Morning, boy." He didn't expect an answer. The ritual wasn't for them, it was for him. It was the act of remembering that proved he was still alive, even if he didn't always feel it. He placed the tintype back on the mantel, its silver gaze following him as he moved to the door, pulling on a sweat-stained hat. Outside, the world was a blast furnace. The ground, a patchwork of baked clay and brittle weeds, crunched under his boots. He worked methodically, his movements economical and devoid of any wasted energy. He checked the line of his fences, the wire humming with tension in the heat. He drew water from the well, the bucket coming up achingly slow, the cool, dark liquid a fleeting miracle against the day. His world had shrunk to this: the perimeter of his land, the needs of his few remaining cattle, the rising and falling of a sun that offered neither warmth nor comfort, only a stark, brutal light. He was a man living in the aftermath, his life a long, quiet epilogue to a story that had ended too soon. He carried his solitude like a shroud, a weary caution that kept his neighbors, the few who remained, at a respectful distance. They saw a man hardened by loss, a figure of quiet strength. They didn't see the man who spoke to a photograph, the man whose dreams were still filled with the phantom weight of a small hand in his. It was in the late afternoon, when the sun began its slow, grudging descent and the shadows stretched like long, skeletal fingers across the plains, that the silence was broken. He was near the southern fence line, wrestling with a post loosened by the unforgiving cycle of bake and freeze, when a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was near the dry creek bed, a place where the heat collected in a visible haze. He squinted, his hand shielding his eyes. It wasn't a coyote, and it wasn't a stray calf. It was small, stumbling, a dark shape against the pale earth. He watched for a moment, his first instinct a deep, ingrained caution. This was Comanche land, or had been until the treaties and the soldiers had pushed them north. But they still hunted here, still crossed these plains on raids, their presence a constant, unspoken threat that hung over the settlers like the ever-present buzzards. A lone rider could be a scout. A lone figure could be a trap. But this figure was too small, its movements too erratic. It staggered, fell, and rose again with a painful slowness. Curiosity, a feeling he hadn't felt in years, pricked at the edges of his grief. He left the fence post and began to walk, his stride long and cautious, his eyes scanning the horizon. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a child, a girl. Her dark hair was matted with dust and burrs, her deerskin dress torn and filthy. She stumbled again, and this time she didn't get up. She lay curled on the hot ground, a small, discarded bundle of humanity. Bear broke into a run, the heavy thud of his boots scattering stones. He reached her side and knelt, the heat of the earth seeping through the knees of his trousers. She was Comanche. There was no mistaking the fine beadwork on the tattered hem of her dress or the cast of her features, even beneath the layers of grime and exhaustion. Her eyes were closed, her face streaked with dried tears and dust. Her lips were cracked and blue, and a faint, shallow breath hitched in her chest. She was starving, dying of thirst, maybe no older than 8. For a long moment, Bear was frozen. Every instinct of self-preservation, every story told around campfires, every warning from the fort screamed at him to turn back, to leave her. Taking her in was an act of war. She was one of them, the enemy. Her people, if they found her here, would see a kidnapper, a killer. His people, if they found him with her, would see a traitor, a fool courting death for himself and for them all. His fragile peace, the hard-won emptiness of his life, was about to be shattered. He could walk away. He could go back to his silent house, his ritual of grief, and let the plains claim her as they had claimed so much else. No one would ever know. But then he looked at her face, small and still, and he didn't see a Comanche. He saw a child. He saw the terrifying fragility of a life on the edge of extinction. He saw the ghost of his own son, Daniel, his face pale with the fever that had stolen his breath. The quiet grief that fueled his every waking moment suddenly found a new and terrible focus. It wasn't empathy that moved him first. It was a raw, agonizing memory. The choice was never a choice at all. His principles, forged in the crucible of his own loss, would not allow it. With a groan that was part effort, part prayer, Bear gently scooped the girl into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a bundle of sharp bones and feverish heat. As he stood, cradling the unconscious child against his chest, he looked out at the vast, indifferent landscape. The sun was touching the horizon, bathing the world in a brief, beautiful, and bloody light. The solitude was over. The war had come home. He carried her back to the cabin, the setting sun at his back casting a long, distorted shadow before them, the shape of a giant bearing a fragile offering. Inside, the familiar quiet of the room felt different now, charged with a terrifying new presence. He laid her gently on his own cot, the rough-spun blanket a stark contrast to her dark skin. Her breath was a shallow whisper, a flickering candle flame in the encroaching darkness of the room. He worked with a focused urgency he hadn't felt in years. He brought a dipper of cool water from the well, tipping it carefully to her cracked lips. At first, she didn't respond. He dipped a corner of a clean rag into the water and moistened her mouth, letting the drops seep in. A faint tremor ran through her. Her eyelids fluttered. He persisted, drop by patient drop, until a weak, reflexive swallow worked in her throat. It was the first victory, small but profound. He felt a surge of something that was almost hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling. As she drank, her eyes opened. They were dark and deep, and for a moment they were filled with a wild animal terror. She tried to scramble away, a pathetic, weak movement, her small hands pushing against his chest. "Easy now," Bear murmured, his voice low and calm, the same tone he used with a spooked horse. "Easy. Just water." He held the dipper out, not moving closer, letting her see it. He took a sip himself, then offered it again. Her eyes, wide and perceptive even in her weakened state, watched him. She saw not a threat, but a slow, gentle giant. Hesitantly, she drank again, this time with a desperate thirst, her small hands coming up to steady the dipper. When she was done, she sank back onto the cot, her energy spent. Her gaze, however, never left him. It was an old gaze in a young face, full of a deep, unnerving watchfulness. He moved to the hearth and stirred the embers of the morning's fire, adding fresh kindling. He put a pot of water on to boil, crumbling in dried jerky and a handful of wild onions to make a thin, nourishing broth. The simple, domestic act was fraught with a tension that vibrated in the very air of the cabin. Every sound, the crackle of the fire, the clink of the pot, the sigh of the girl on the cot, was amplified in the charged silence. He was keenly aware of the gulf between them, a chasm of language, culture, and a history written in blood. He was a white man, a settler, a trespasser in the eyes of her people. She was Comanche, a symbol of the wildness and danger that haunted the edges of his world. And here they were, sharing the intimate space of his home, bound by a simple, desperate human need. As the broth simmered, filling the small cabin with a savory aroma, he looked more closely at the girl. The firelight flickered across the intricate beadwork on her deerskin dress. The patterns were complex, the colors rich, deep blues, vibrant reds, and stark whites, woven with a skill that spoke of purpose and status. And then he saw it. Around her neck, partially hidden in the matted tangles of her hair, was a necklace. It wasn't just decorative. It was made of polished bone, carved eagle feathers, and a single large turquoise stone at its center. It was ceremonial, significant. Bear felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was not just any child. The care in her dress, the significance of the necklace. She was important. The daughter of a chief, perhaps. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through him. He hadn't just rescued a child. He had taken a princess. Her absence wouldn't be a mystery for long. It would be a call to arms. He brought her a small bowl of the broth, sitting on a stool a few feet from the cot. He blew on the spoon to cool it, his movements slow and deliberate. She watched him, her dark eyes tracking his every move. When he offered her the first spoonful, she hesitated, her gaze dropping to the bowl and then back to his face, searching. He didn't push. He simply held it, waiting. Finally, she opened her mouth and accepted it. She ate slowly at first, then with a growing hunger, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a more primal need. As she ate, a little color returned to her cheeks. The deep watchfulness in her eyes softened, replaced by a profound weariness. When the bowl was empty, she laid her head back down, her small body seeming to sink into the mattress, and for the first time since he'd found her, she fell into a true, deep sleep. Bear watched her for a long time, the empty bowl in his hands. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the world was sinking into a deep, starless dark. He felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, the quiet satisfaction of a good deed done. But it was a fragile peace, a temporary reprieve. He knew what was coming. It was a question of when, not if. The answer came sooner than he expected, but not from the direction he anticipated. A hard, frantic pounding on his door shattered the quiet. "Mallister! Bear, open up!" The voice was sharp with panic. It was Cletus Hartwell, his nearest neighbor from a few miles east, a man whose courage was always loudest when fear was at its peak. Bear moved to the door, his body instinctively shielding the sleeping girl from view. He opened it a crack. Cletus stood on his porch, his face pale and sweating in the moonlight, a rifle clutched in his white-knuckled grip. Behind him stood Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison, a younger man whose authority sat on him like a borrowed coat, too big and ill-fitting. Jake's hand rested on the butt of his pistol, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring, but only amplified the tension. "What is it, Cletus?" Bear asked. his voice a low rumble. "There's talk, Bear," Cletus whispered, his eyes wide and darting, trying to see past Bear into the cabin. "The Comanche. A war party's been spotted north of the Red River. They're looking for something, or someone. Word is it's White Bull's girl. She's missing." Bear's blood ran cold. Chief White Bull, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. A powerful, strategic, and notoriously unforgiving leader. He had lost his son to the soldiers 2 years prior. The loss of his daughter would unleash a storm that would drown them all. "What's that got to do with me?" Bear asked, his face an impassive mask. But it was too late. Jake's eyes narrowed, catching a flicker of movement from inside. He pushed past Cletus, his hand now drawing his pistol. "What in God's name are you doing, Mallister?" he breathed, his eyes locking on the small form sleeping on the cot. Cletus craned his neck and let out a strangled gasp. "Sweet Jesus. You've got her. You've got the chief's daughter." "I found her near the creek bed," Bear said, his voice flat and hard. "She was half dead." "Found her or took her?" Jake snapped, his fear making him aggressive. "It makes no difference now. They'll think you stole her. They'll burn every settlement from here to the Kansas line to get her back. You've brought a death sentence on us all." Cletus was pacing on the small porch, his panic reaching a fever pitch. "We gotta get her out of here. We gotta give her back. Or we gotta get rid of her. Make it look like she was never here." The words hung in the air, ugly and desperate. Bear turned his head slowly, his eyes fixing Cletus with a look so cold and dangerous that the smaller man flinched back. "You will not touch her," Bear said, each word a piece of granite. "She's a child." "She's a savage," Jake retorted, his pistol still leveled, though his hand was trembling. "And you're a fool, Bear. Your grief has made you soft. You're gonna get us all killed for one of them." Suddenly, from the far distance, a new sound began. It was low and rhythmic, a deep thrumming that seemed to vibrate up from the very soles of their feet. It was a sound that every settler knew and dreaded. War drums. They were faint at first, a distant heartbeat, a whisper of impending doom carried on the night air. But they were unmistakable, and they were getting closer. Cletus's face went slack with terror. "They're coming!" he whimpered. "Oh God, they know she's here!" Jake backed away from the door, his face ashen. "This is on you, Mallister," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Bear. "When they come, you're on your own." He turned and fled into the darkness, Cletus scrambling after him, their panicked footsteps fading into the night. Bear closed the door and slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. He was alone again, but the silence was gone. It had been replaced by the steady, growing pulse of the drums. It was the sound of a closing fist. He looked at the girl, still sleeping, blissfully unaware of the storm she had brought to his doorstep. Her small chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. He walked to the mantel and picked up the tintype. He looked at the faces of his wife and son, their silvered eyes seeming to watch him. He had made a choice to save one child, driven by the memory of the one he had lost. Now the consequences of that choice were coming for him, riding on the relentless rhythm of the drums. The cabin, once his sanctuary of grief, had become a prison, and outside in the vast, waiting darkness, an army was gathering, and justice, in one form or another, was on its way. The thrumming of the drums was no longer a sound, it was a physical presence. It burrowed into the log walls of the cabin, vibrated up through the floorboards, and settled deep in Bear's bones. It was a language he didn't speak but understood perfectly, a slow, methodical gathering of rage. Sleep was impossible. He sat in his chair by the cold hearth, a shotgun resting across his lap, though he knew it was a useless gesture. A single man against a war party was not a fight. It was a foregone conclusion. His senses were stretched to their limits. Every creak of the house, every skittering sound of a night creature outside, sent a jolt through him. He was a stone in the middle of a river, waiting for the flood. The girl stirred on the cot. Her eyes opened, no longer clouded with fever, but clear and intelligent. She looked at him, then at the bolted door, then back at him. She heard the drums, too. Her face showed no fear, only a solemn understanding. She sat up, her small frame silhouetted against the faint moonlight filtering through the window. She pointed a small finger towards the sound, then looked at him, her expression a question. He could only give a slow, grim nod. Yes, they are coming for you. Her gaze was steady. There was a composure in her, a quiet dignity that belied her years. She was the daughter of a chief, and she wore her heritage not like a necklace, but like a second skin. Hours crawled by, each one stretching into an eternity marked by the relentless pulse of the drums. The sound grew louder, closer, splitting into distinct rhythms, a complex and terrifying symphony of purpose. It was no longer a distant heartbeat. It was the thunder of an approaching storm, right outside his walls. Dawn was a pale, sickly gray line on the eastern horizon when the drums stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was a held breath, a drawn bowstring. Bear rose from his chair and moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. He didn't see them at first. The prairie was empty, cloaked in the pre-dawn mist. And then, as if the land itself had given birth to them, they were there. They didn't charge. They didn't scream. They emerged from the gloom in a silent, disciplined wave, a tide of painted flesh and lethal steel. There were dozens, then 100, then more. They fanned out, forming a perfect silent circle around his small cabin, each warrior on his pony, a lance or a bow held at the ready. Their faces were painted for war, stark patterns of black and red, grim masks of vengeance. They sat their horses with an unnerving stillness, their collective gaze fixed on the small wooden house, a ring of silent, terrifying judgment. 200 warriors, a force that could have wiped out the nearby town without breaking a sweat, had come for one man and one child. In the center of the line, a horseman emerged. He was taller than the others, his presence radiating an authority that was absolute. He wore a magnificent war bonnet of eagle feathers that cascaded down his back, and his bare chest was a canvas of old scars and fresh paint. Even from a distance, Bear could feel the immense weight of his grief and fury. It was Chief White Bull. The girl behind him made a small sound. Bear turned. She was standing, her eyes fixed on the figure outside. A single word escaped her lips, a whisper full of awe and longing. 8, she said. Father. The chief raised a hand, and a warrior dismounted, striding toward the cabin. He stopped 20 paces from the door, a lone figure in the vast, tense silence. He called out, his voice sharp and clear in the morning air, speaking in the Comanche tongue. Bear didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. It was a demand. Come out, bring the girl. Bear looked at the girl. Her eyes were wide, but she nodded, a small, brave gesture. She trusted him. The weight of that trust was heavier than the 200 lances pointed at his home. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and doom. He laid the shotgun on the table. Violence was not an answer here. It never was. His only weapon was the truth, and he wasn't sure it would be enough. He unbolted the door and pushed it open, stepping out onto the porch, his hands raised and empty to show he was unarmed. The morning sun, now clearing the horizon, struck him full in the face, making him squint. He stood there, a solitary figure against the dark wood of his home, facing an army. 200 pairs of eyes, filled with a cold, unified hatred, were fixed on him. The sheer pressure of their gaze was a physical force. Then he stepped aside, revealing the girl standing in the doorway behind him. A collective murmur rippled through the warriors. Their eyes shifted from Bear to the child, and the hard lines of their faces softened for a fraction of a second. Relief. But it was immediately replaced by a renewed, focused anger directed at him, the man who had taken her. Chief White Bull urged his horse forward, stopping just beyond the lone warrior who had called out. He dismounted with a fluid grace, his eyes dark and piercing, never leaving Bear. He walked forward until he stood a mere 10 feet away, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over Bear in the morning light. The chief's face was a mask of controlled fury, but beneath it, Bear saw the raw, ragged edge of a father's terror. He had seen that look before, in his own shaving mirror in the days after he'd buried his family. White Bull spoke, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The words were Comanche, but the accusation was universal. You, kidnapper, defiler. Bear didn't have the words to answer back. He couldn't explain. He was trapped behind a wall of language, framed by circumstance as the very thing he was not. His act of kindness was a crime. His mercy was his indictment. He was powerless, surrounded, and utterly, terrifyingly alone. The girl took a tentative step forward, wanting to run to her father, but a sharp glance from White Bull froze her in place. The trial would happen first. The chief's gaze swept over Bear, dismissing him as nothing more than a dead man waiting for the sentence to be carried out. His eyes then fell upon the cabin's dark interior. For a moment, it seemed he was looking for signs of a struggle, for evidence to confirm his rage. Bear knew he had only one chance. It was a desperate, foolish gamble, a shot in the darkest of nights. He slowly, deliberately, lowered his hands. He turned his back on the chief, an act of either supreme faith or ultimate folly, and walked back into the cabin. A sharp intake of breath came from the warriors. An arrow creaked as it was drawn taut on a bowstring. White Bull did not move, his eyes narrowed, watching. Bear walked to the mantelpiece. His hand, shaking almost imperceptibly, reached out and took the tintype photograph. He turned back and walked out onto the porch, into the full, damning sunlight. He held the worn silver plate in his open palm, an offering. He didn't look at the chief. He looked at the photograph. He let all his grief, all the loss, all the silent, screaming pain of the last 3 years fill his face. He let the mask of the hard, solitary rancher fall away, revealing the broken father beneath. He then lifted his gaze and took the final few steps toward Chief White Bull, stopping just out of arm's reach. He held out the photograph. The chief's eyes flickered down to the object in Bear's hand, his expression a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. What weapon was this? What trickery? He looked from the photo to Bear's face, and for the first time he saw something other than a white enemy. He saw the echo of his own fear, the landscape of his own loss. Hesitantly, White Bull reached out and took the tintype. He held the small, heavy object in his palm and looked at the image of Sarah and Daniel. He saw the woman's tired smile, the fierce pride in the boy's eyes. He looked at the small child in the picture, a boy with dark hair and a serious mouth, and then his gaze lifted across the yard to his own daughter, standing small and safe in the doorway. The connection was instantaneous, a spark jumping a chasm of hatred and misunderstanding. It was a language that needed no translation. Fatherhood, loss, the terrifying love for a child. A crack appeared in the great wall of his hostility. The rage in his eyes did not vanish, but it was joined by something else. A flicker of shared, silent acknowledgement. He looked from the photograph back to Bear, and in that moment, 2 enemies, 2 fathers, saw each other for the first time. The air was still thick with the promise of violence. The lances were still aimed, but the world had shifted on its axis. The trial was not over, but its nature had fundamentally changed. Chief White Bull did not speak. He simply held the tintype photograph in his hand, his thumb stroking the cool, worn metal, as if trying to absorb the story it held. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the nervous stamp of a horse's hoof, the jingle of a bridle. The 200 warriors watched their leader, their expressions shifting from pure hostility to a tense confusion. They saw the exchange, saw the object in their chief's hand, saw the subtle but profound shift in his posture. The immediate, bloodthirsty certainty of the moment had evaporated, replaced by a question. White Bull finally looked up from the photograph, his eyes meeting Bear's. He gave a short, sharp nod, not of forgiveness, but of understanding. Then he turned and handed the tintype to the warrior beside him, who looked at it with a frown before passing it to the next man. The small, silvered image began a slow, deliberate journey down the line, passed from one calloused hand to another. As each warrior saw the image of Sarah and Daniel, a subtle change occurred. The hard set of their jaws softened. The murderous light in their eyes flickered. They were seeing not just the face of their enemy's family, but a reflection of their own, the wives, the sons, the daughters they fought and died for. Bear's private grief was becoming a public testament. White Bull spoke a single, guttural command. 2 warriors dismounted and walked towards Bear. He tensed, his instincts screaming, but he held his ground. They did not touch him with violence. One took his right arm, the other his left, their grips firm, but not brutal. He was a prisoner, but a prisoner of a different kind now. They led him towards the center of the circle of warriors. The girl, seeing him being taken, cried out and ran from the porch. She threw her arms around Bear's leg, her small face pressed against the rough denim of his trousers. "Nuh-uh!" she cried, a defiant "No!" White Bull watched this, his expression unreadable. He walked to his daughter and knelt before her, speaking to her in low, gentle tones. She answered him in a rush of words, her hands gesturing first to Bear, then to the inside of the cabin, then to her own stomach. She was telling the story, her story. The chief listened intently, his gaze occasionally flicking to Bear. When she was finished, he placed a hand on her head, a gesture of reassurance. He spoke again, and this time she looked at Bear and then back at her father, and nodded. She released her grip. The decision was made. He would go with them. They brought forward a horse for him, a scrawny, paintless nag, a clear statement of his status. They did not bind his hands, another small but significant gesture. He was being taken not to an execution, but to a judgment. As they mounted up, the warrior who had first held the tintype rode up and handed it back to him. Bear took it, his fingers closing around the familiar object. It was his only possession in this world that mattered, and they were returning it to him. The journey began. Bear rode in the center of the immense procession, a river of silent warriors flowing around him. They moved with the fluid grace of men born to the saddle, their ponies traversing the rough terrain as if it were a smooth road. He was leaving his world behind, the small, solitary island of his ranch shrinking in the distance. He was being pulled into the heart of their territory, a place no white man had seen and lived to describe. The landscape changed, growing wilder, more rugged. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and mesquite, then to steep-sided canyons carved by ancient rivers. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them, but the warriors seemed immune to it. They rode with a stoic patience, their silence a stark contrast to the thundering drums of the night before. After hours of riding, they descended into a wide, protected valley. A river, a true, flowing river, snaked through its center, its banks lined with cottonwood trees. And nestled in a bend of the river was the Comanche village. It was larger than he could have imagined. Hundreds of teepees, their tanned hides decorated with vibrant symbols and histories, stood in sprawling, organized circles. The air buzzed with life, the sounds of children laughing, dogs barking, women calling to one another as they worked hides or tended cook fires. As the war party entered the village, a hush fell. Every face turned towards them, towards the strange, towering white man in their midst. Eyes filled with suspicion, fear, and a raw, open hatred watched him pass. He was the enemy, brought into their sacred home. He could feel their animosity like a physical touch, 1,000 invisible knives pricking at his skin. They led him to the center of the village, to a large, open space before a teepee that was bigger and more grandly decorated than the rest. It was White Bull's lodge. A great fire was already burning in a shallow pit, its flames licking at the twilight sky. The entire village seemed to gather, forming a massive circle around the fire, their faces illuminated and flickering in the orange glow. This was not just a trial, it was a public spectacle. Bear was made to stand alone before the fire, facing the entrance of the chief's lodge. The heat of the flames warmed his back, but a deep, unshakable chill had settled in his core. He clutched the tintype in his pocket, its sharp edge a small, cold point of reality in a world that felt like a nightmare. From the great lodge emerged 7 men. They were old, their faces maps of deep wrinkles, their hair long and gray. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their presence commanding an immediate, reverent silence from the assembled crowd. These were the tribal elders, the council of wise men. They wore simple buckskin, adorned not with the feathers of war, but with the symbols of wisdom and justice. They took their seats on buffalo robes arranged in a semicircle, with Chief White Bull sitting slightly apart from them, not as a leader, but as a petitioner, a father seeking justice for his child. The trial was about to begin. The silence was absolute, the only sound the crackle and hiss of the great fire. A warrior stepped forward into the firelight. Bear recognized him from the morning. He had been one of the most vocal in his silent fury. He was lean and powerful, with a jagged scar running down his cheek and eyes that burned with a fanatical intensity. He began to speak, his voice ringing with passion and rage. This, Bear knew instinctively, was Broken Arrow. He couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was carried in his tone, in his gestures. He pointed a finger at Bear, his voice rising in accusation. He spoke of the blood-for-blood tradition, of the sanctity of their laws. He paced before the fire, his words whipping the crowd into a low, menacing growl. He spoke of his own brother, killed by settlers in a raid just a season ago, his voice cracking with a grief that mirrored Bear's own, but twisted into a demand for vengeance. He was painting Bear with the brush of every crime, every broken treaty, every injustice his people had ever suffered at the hands of the white man. Bear was not a person, he was a symbol of their oppression, and his death was required as payment. When Broken Arrow finished, he slammed the butt of his lance into the ground. A roar of approval went up from the crowd. The air vibrated with their collective call for blood. Bear stood perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt the weight of their history, the righteous anger of a people pushed to the brink. In their eyes, his guilt was absolute. The elders sat impassively, their ancient faces giving nothing away. Then the lead elder, a man with a face like carved oak, raised a hand. The crowd fell silent. He looked not at Bear, but at the small girl who stood beside her father. He spoke to her, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Tell us what happened." All eyes turned to the child. Chief White Bull's daughter, whose name Bear still did not know, stepped forward. She stood in the same spot where Broken Arrow had just stood, a tiny figure in the vast, hostile arena. She did not seem afraid. She looked at the council, at the faces in the crowd, and then her eyes found Bear's across the fire. She began to speak. Her voice was small, but it was clear and carried in the intense silence. She didn't just describe what had happened. She translated it. She told them of waking in the parched creek bed, believing she was going to die. She described the big man who found her, how his hands were gentle when he lifted her. She told them how he gave her water, drop by drop, before he drank any himself. The crowd murmured, a different sound this time, one of confusion and interest. Then she did something extraordinary. She walked over to Bear. The crowd gasped. She pointed to his face, to his eyes, and spoke to the council. "Ista pasa pa," she said, her voice full of a child's simple, profound insight. "His eyes are dark water. They rain on the inside." She then pointed to his chest. "His heart is a bird with a broken wing. It still tries to sing." She had not seen his grief. She had felt it. She had understood it. Then she reached into the pocket of his trousers. Bear didn't flinch. He let her. Her small hand emerged, clutching the tintype photograph. She held it up for the council to see, the firelight glinting off the silvered plate. "This is the broken wing," she said, her voice ringing with an unassailable truth. He speaks to them in the morning. He speaks to them when the sun sleeps. This is why he gave me water. This is why he gave me food. He saw his own lost child in me. She walked to the lead elder and placed the photograph in his ancient, wrinkled hand. The old man looked at it for a long time. He looked at the faces of Sarah and Daniel. He looked at the small, brave girl standing before him. He looked at Chief White Bull, whose face was now a mask of stunned, dawning realization. And finally, he looked across the fire at Bear, the tall, solitary white man. And for the first time, he truly saw him. The innocence and truth in the child's voice had done what no weapon, no argument, no defense could ever have done. It had cut through generations of anger and prejudice and laid bare the simple human heart of the matter. The elder passed the photograph to the man next to him. Once again, the image of Sarah and Daniel made its solemn journey through the hands of the council. The deliberation began, a long, unbearable silence where the fate of one man, and perhaps the fate of two peoples, hung suspended in the flickering firelight. The 7 elders sat like stone effigies, their eyes closed or cast down towards the fire. The only sound was the crackle of burning logs and the collective, held breath of the Comanche nation. Bear stood rooted to the spot, the warmth of the fire on his back a stark contrast to the glacial fear that had encased his heart. He had been stripped bare, his deepest grief laid out as his only defense, and now he could do nothing but wait. Chief White Bull's gaze was fixed on his daughter, who had returned to his side, her small hand clutching his. His face, once a mask of implacable fury, was now a complex terrain of conflicting emotions, the pride of a father, the shock of revelation, the heavy weight of his own impending judgment. Broken Arrow stood apart, his lance held tight in his fist, his body coiled like a snake. His eyes burned with undiluted hatred, not just for Bear, but for the turn things had taken, for the potential betrayal of the old ways. Finally, the lead elder opened his eyes. They were ancient, dark, and held the wisdom of 1,000 seasons. He looked at each of the other elders in turn, receiving a slow, almost imperceptible nod from each one. A consensus had been reached. He rose to his feet with a surprising agility, his tall, spare frame commanding the absolute attention of everyone present. He held the tintype photograph in his hand. "The law of the people is blood for blood," he began, his voice raspy but carrying to the furthest edges of the crowd. A murmur of approval went through the warriors, and Broken Arrow allowed himself a grim smile. The elder let the murmur die down before continuing. "It is a strong law. It protects us. It honors our fallen." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, then landing on Broken Arrow. "But the law is for men who have no eyes to see and no ears to hear. It is for men whose hearts are stone. A man who follows the law without wisdom is no better than a wolf that kills for sport." The smile on Broken Arrow's face vanished. The elder turned his gaze to Bear. "This man," he said, his voice rising in strength, "did not act as an enemy. An enemy would have left a child to die. An enemy would have taken her with violence. An enemy would have hidden his crime." He held up the tintype. "This man's heart has been broken. The earth has drunk the tears of his sorrow. He looked upon a dying child, and he did not see a Comanche. He saw a child, and in her he saw his own spirit, lost and wandering. His grief did not make him weak. It made him strong enough to choose kindness when all the world whispered of hatred." The elder walked towards Bear, stopping directly in front of him. He did not look at him with contempt, but with a deep, searching respect. "The girl speaks truth," the elder declared, his voice ringing through the valley. "She says his eyes reign on the inside. Our law does not demand the blood of a man who carries a storm of grief in his own soul. To kill such a man is not justice. It is to add a new sorrow to the world, and the world has enough sorrow." He turned to the crowd. The judgment of this council is not death. A gasp went through the assembly. Broken Arrow took a step forward, his face contorted in disbelief and rage, but the elder's sharp gaze stopped him cold. The judgment is not acquittal. An acquittal would forget the blood that has been spilled between our peoples. He let the weight of his words settle. The judgment is alliance. The word fell into the silence with the force of a thunderclap. No one understood. It was a concept so foreign, so impossible, that it had no place in their world. The elder explained, "This man, Thaddeus Bear Mallister, will not be harmed. He is to be honored. His ranch, the place where he showed mercy to the daughter of our chief, will be considered sacred ground. A sanctuary. No warrior will raid his lands. No harm will come to his cattle. He will be protected by the people." He then turned to Chief White Bull. "And he will be more. He will be a bridge. He will be the man we speak to when we must speak to the whites. He will be the man they speak to when they must speak to us. His kindness has earned him this burden, this honor." Chief White Bull rose and walked to stand beside the elder. He looked at Bear, and for the first time there was no hostility in his eyes, only a profound, weary respect. He spoke, his voice deep and resonant. "My heart is with the council. This man saved my daughter. He did not save a Comanche. He saved my heart. From this day forward he is Nomana'a, our friend. He who harms him, harms me." The declaration was absolute. The judgment was sealed. Broken Arrow, shaking with fury, spat on the ground and turned, stalking away into the darkness, a solitary figure of dissent. But his rage was now powerless. The word of the council, backed by the chief, was law. The ride back to his ranch the next morning was a world away from the journey that had brought him here. He rode not a nag, but a fine, strong pony gifted to him by the chief himself. He was not surrounded by captors, but by an honor guard of 10 elite warriors, led by White Bull. They rode not in silence, but with a quiet, emerging camaraderie. One warrior shared his dried meat with Bear. Another pointed out a landmark, naming it in the Comanche tongue. They were small gestures, the first tentative threads of a bridge being woven between two worlds. When they arrived at the crest of the hill overlooking his ranch, they stopped. The small clapboard house stood in the morning light, no longer a prison, but a home. It looked small, fragile, and impossibly peaceful. White Bull rode up beside him. He pointed to the house. "Winu, safe," he said, one of the few English words he knew. He then reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a peace pipe, its stone bowl intricately carved, its stem adorned with beads and feathers. It was a gift of immense significance. Bear accepted it, his throat too thick with emotion to speak. He could only nod his thanks. The chief's daughter then urged her pony forward. She smiled at Bear, a brilliant open smile that transformed her solemn face. She held out her hand, and in it was her own necklace, the one of polished bone and turquoise. She wanted him to have it. He gently pushed her hand back. "No, little one," he said, his voice rough. "That is yours. You are the daughter of a chief." He reached into his own saddlebag and brought out the small wooden horse that had belonged to his son, Daniel. He had carried it with him for 3 years, another small anchor to his past. He held it out to her. Her eyes widened. She took the small, worn toy with a reverence that touched him to the core. A gift for a gift. A story for a story. White Bull and his daughter turned and, with the rest of the warriors, rode away, leaving Bear alone on the hill, watching them go. He was still the solitary rancher, but the nature of his solitude had changed. It was no longer an emptiness, but a quiet space filled with a new, hard-earned peace. In the weeks and months that followed, the world shifted. His ranch became what the elder had decreed, a sanctuary. Settlers, hearing the story, were wary at first, but fear of the Comanche was stronger than their suspicion of Bear. They began to use his land as a neutral ground for trade. Cautious at first, then with growing confidence, Parties of settlers would meet with Comanche hunting bands on his property, exchanging goods under Bear's watchful eye. The first trades were tense, silent affairs, a pile of blankets for a stack of furs, with no words exchanged. But slowly, trust began to grow, one splinter and scar at a time. A settler learned a Comanche word for thank you. A warrior helped reshoe a settler's lame horse. Bear's home, once a monument to grief, became a symbol of fragile emerging hope. He was no longer just Bear Mallister. He was the bridge. Years passed. The world continued its relentless march. More settlers came. Treaties were broken and remade, but the pocket of peace around Bear's ranch held. The lines of hatred and fear, once so stark and absolute, had blurred into something more complex, more human. The story of the white man and the chief's daughter became a legend, a touchstone for both peoples. The story ends, as it so often did, with a shared meal. It was a late summer afternoon, the sun casting a golden, forgiving light across the plains. Bear, his hair now streaked with gray, sat on his porch. Across from him sat a young woman, poised and confident, her eyes holding the same deep intelligence he remembered from her childhood. She was the chief's daughter, now a respected leader in her own right, a peacekeeper known for her wisdom and courage. She was visiting, as she did every year on the anniversary of the day he had found her. Her own children now played in the yard near the well, their laughter a sound that filled the last empty spaces in Bear's heart. She gestured to the mantelpiece inside, where the tintype photograph still sat. Beside it now rested a small, worn wooden horse. "He still watches over this house," she said, her voice soft. Bear nodded, looking at the photograph of his Sarah and Daniel. The ache of their loss was still there, a dull, familiar companion. But it was no longer a solitary grief. It had been shared, transformed, and woven into the fabric of a new beginning. It had become the foundation of a trust that had reshaped two worlds. "Yes," Bear said, a small, quiet smile touching his lips. "And he is not alone." The sun dipped below the horizon, and in the quiet peace of the twilight, the legacy of a single act of kindness settled over the land, as soft and as enduring as the dust.